Well, an inquiry into nuclear power will soon be open to submissions as the government investigates the viability of the industry in Australia. The inquiry's terms of reference are yet to be set out, but the cross-parliamentary committee is expected to assess whether nuclear power has the support of the community. Well, joining me is Patrick Burr, a lecturer in nuclear engineering at the University of New South Wales. Good morning to you, Patrick. So what is this inquiry really about?
Good morning. Technically, it has a very clear mandate, which is that of saying, well, we have a lot of renewable energy. We're probably going to have a lot more in the future. Could, in a hypothetical future, the nuclear energy help balance the system? In other words, help deal with some of the issues with intermittency that we know happen with renewable energy. But I think it's a lot more than that. I think it's actually an opening for a discussion about nuclear energy, a discussion that Australia I don't think has had yet. We know it's a very polarizing issue, nuclear energy, so you tend to have people that really dislike it or really like it, and very rarely there's willing to discuss openly and change their minds. And I think the first port of call is really to try and have this real conversation based on real information. And I think that's really what the inquiry is going for.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you. I think this conversation definitely needs to take place. But how likely is it? I mean, there's so many complications with getting it going. It's going to take years to plan. I mean, in excess of 5 years to plan. It's going to take in excess of 5 years to build. You need help from the private sector. You need bipartisan support too. So if one government backs it and goes ahead with it, then it can be reversed if there's a change of government. So there's a lot of complications there. So in your view, how likely is it to happen?
Well, there's a lot of things mixed in there. Right? I think you highlighted the most important point, which is the greatest challenge of nuclear is not really a technological one. We know how it works. We know it can be cheap if it's done really right. But we also know that it has a very big obstacle, which is that of it's unpopular, effectively. And in countries where there is no societal acceptance, there's been little community engagement, then typically nuclear power ends up being delayed and there's large, huge costs, and then it becomes an expensive option and not one that actually helps very much. On the other side, you have countries that have a lot of support for nuclear. In those countries, things run more smoothly, and nuclear power really helps decarbonize the system in a very cost-effective way. Often it is actually the cheapest option in those cases. So what we're tapping into is really how do we get support from community? It is basically well understood that if we try and impose it onto a country, it often doesn't work. But if the country wants it, then it usually works well. And in order for the country to want it, you need to have a conversation. And the first step in the conversation, I think, is not to have this sort of really bipolar view of, oh, it's great, it's fantastic, if you think otherwise you're wrong, or, oh, no, it's cost expensive, it's dangerous, and I don't want to hear about it. It's really to see it as what it is, which is just an energy technology. And as such, all energy technologies have both pros and cons, and really nothing is outrageously bad or outrageously good, really. If we have this more sensible view of it, then we can have a real conversation, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's our former Prime Minister's view that renewables and storage is still the cheapest option. But is nuclear cheaper than renewables, according to your research?
I think both the research that we do at UNSW and elsewhere in the world, but also real experience from the world tells us that it can go both ways. In the news, we've seen in the past year or so examples in America, in France, and a few other countries where reactors have gone over time and over budget. And that directly means that the energy that comes out of it, the electricity, is going to cost more. But at the same time, even though we don't hear it in the news because it's much of a non-news, there are many more reactors that are built, about 50 in the world right now, that are actually on time and on budget. In fact, in some cases, they're under budget. And the direct consequence of that, it means that those reactors will be, the energy from those reactors will be very cheap. Examples are, for instance, in South Korea, China, Russia, I believe also India is on time and on budget, certainly the Middle East countries. So I think in a hypothetical future, if a future generation in Australia wishes to consider nuclear, the idea would be to perhaps partner with these countries that have a good track record, as well as building on our current expertise of nuclear technologies. Because although we don't have a nuclear power program, we certainly have a lot of expertise in other nuclear technologies. In fact, we're world leaders in many of these regards, like nuclear medicine, safeguards, and a few more. And we do train nuclear engineers at UNSW, and we would have to ramp up that significantly a lot more.
Yeah, well, I mean, the problem is it's a tough sell. It's a tough sell to people because it's got to be coastal, it's got to use a lot of water. No one wants to live near them because of, radiation. That's because of Chernobyl and Fukushima. But just quickly, if you wouldn't mind, do you know much about these nuclear batteries that people are talking about now that are used in submarines? So they're a lot smaller and may well be more effective.
Yes, indeed. I mean, small modular reactors are really all the hype right now in the world. The nuclear technology is evolving really quite fast at this time. And even the research that we're doing research at UNSW on accident-tolerant fuels, for instance, and also nuclear for space applications and so on. And it really is moving quite drastically. I think this inquiry is tapping into this, is realizing that the future might look very different from what we know now, both the energy requirements and also the technologies available. Right now, if you want to put a conventional nuclear power reactors, you probably choose a coal site because the requirements are very similar. It needs the roads, it needs electricity connections, and it needs a bit of water, pretty much the same amount really as coal. So not a huge amount, but it does need a bit of water. These small modular reactors, which are very similar to submarine reactors, in fact, even though the technology is very mature, there's a lot of innovation in how we approach the problem. These are typically startups, sometimes even from university or student-led projects that have become startups, and they're saying, well, can we develop packages where you basically put a reactor on the back of a truck, you drive it to where you want to put it, which might be, in the case of Australia, we would think of somewhere like a remote community or perhaps a mining site where it's very difficult to get power from the grid. We just put it there and it's sort of self-contained, requires no water, very little water, very little maintenance. And I think the inquiry is actually looking into, would this type of reactor be more appropriate for Australia in the future, or would we go for more conventional ones, or neither?
All right, Patrick Burr, I mean, like you said, it's a conversation that's worth having, and that's what we're doing now, and that's what the government is pushing towards. So it's an interesting debate, one we're having. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you for having me.